You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch UK Radio.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Haunted Histories on Parasearch UK Radio with me, your haunted hostess, with hopefully the mostess, Penny G. Morgan. Just a technical note before we start. We've had a few elements of feedback on the sound quality of the show. We've done quite a bit of technical work, so hopefully it will sound a lot better for everyone listening. But please do feel free to let us know if there's any way we can improve it further. Right, so far in this series we've looked at two very interesting places, Kilmainham Jail in Dublin and the infamous Tower of London in, surprisingly enough, London. Tonight's show is about a little known place called Chislehurst Caves. To test the waters on this place, I did actually ask a few friends of mine if they had heard of it, and no was the resounding answer. And they were even more surprised when I told them it was just outside of Bromley in Greater London. Some thought it might have been a smuggler's caves, some thought it must be down on the south coast somewhere. So to find out this historical, for want of a better word, landmark is just up the road if you live in Greater London was quite astounding for them. Now, it's not necessarily that I'm a know-it-all who has all the information on every single place in the UK at my fingertips, although it has been said before that I appear to be a general knowledge oracle, which I still haven't decided if that was a compliment or an insult. But I was introduced to this place, Chislehurst Caves, about 10 years ago, and it made quite an impact on me as I found out more about it. So, what are Chislehurst Caves? Well, the name is a bit of a misnomer because although they are called caves, they're actually man-made and are around a 22-mile long series of tunnels built from, well, created, I suppose, from the chalk and flint excavation that has gone on there over the hundreds and hundreds of years prior. There is some dispute as to how old they are, but there are records from the 1200s, as far back as the 1200s, confirming that there was flint mining going on in the area. There are rumours aplenty as to what else has gone on in the caves and the tunnels, but what we do know for definite is that during World War I, they were used as a weapons storage facility to aid the Woolwich Arsenal. And they were used to actually grow mushrooms, believe it or not, in the period between World War I and World War II. The reason I came to hear about them was the fact that they were used as an air raid shelter during World War II, which is the era I will be looking at from a historical basis tonight. To a music fan like myself, their latter-day use is also intriguing. Part of it was used as a music venue. Musicians like David Bowie, Jimi Hendrix, Pink Floyd and even Status Quo played there. The Beatles had the Cavern. Hendrix had the Caves. You will probably find I wax slightly lyrical about this place. It's an absolutely fascinating place to visit, and you can actually visit there. It is open to the public, and the tour guide's absolutely superb, and they will walk you around, show you the different areas, some of which I'm actually going to mention tonight, and you can find out about all the different myths and facts surrounding the caves. And they are, remember, only a stone's throw out of London. So if you are based in the Greater London area, take a trip out to Bromley. It's not that far, and I'm pretty sure they're open pretty much every day of the week, but they're a very, very interesting trip. So, before I start my my history lesson, as I've been told it's being called at the moment, and what was happening in Britain at that time that necessitated a former flint and chalk mine being used for families to shelter in whilst they were being bombed. I actually want to tell you the story of how I found out about it. So, my day job involves me meeting with lots and lots of different types of people. I won't go into detail as to what I do, but I do tend to meet lots and lots of different age groups, different generations of people. And I was chatting with one of my clients who was in his mid-80s, and he had absolutely fascinating stories he could tell me. We were talking about 10 years ago here. He mentioned one that he remembered being in his bedroom and seeing a German fighter plane coming towards his window across the fields. He actually saw the German pilot gesticulating at him to move before his father grabbed him out of his room and threw him on the floor on the landing. The German pilot actually avoided the house and crash-landed in one of the fields nearby, but he said he remembered seeing the look on this pilot's eyes, knowing that he was going to have to crash somewhere. But he told me this story. He said, I lived near Biggin Hill, which in the 1940s was a major RAF base being used in the war. I'll add, we are going to talk about more of that later. One night, he told me, our street was bombed quite badly, but we were used to it being bombed on a regular basis, as the German planes would come in trying to hit the airbase, and would hit us instead. Anyway, my next-door neighbour's house was blown away one night, but the engineers came and checked our home and said it was safe. The irony of this, he told me subsequently, was that he actually became a civil engineer, and he said that knowing what he knew now, that house should have been condemned, as one more explosion nearby would have sent it collapsing around their ears. But at the time, with the amount of houses that were being destroyed or damaged, and with the amount of people who were being made homeless, it really was the case of make do and mend. So, back to my story. My client says, my dad decided that it really wasn't safe to stay there, as we were rushing out to our Anderson shelter pretty much every night, and we knew that if we were hit directly, which was a distinct possibility, that we wouldn't survive. Our neighbour across the street would disappear regularly and come home with his family the next day, so my dad asked him where he was going. He told him it was a place called Chislehurst Caves, just up the road, which had been turned into a massive air raid shelter. We went there that night, and then spent pretty much the next 6 months living there. On the back of this story, I started looking into Chislehurst Caves myself. And I even told my dad about it, as my parents like their history. It's probably where I get my love of it from. And I found out that he already knew about the place, because in the 1950s he'd been dared to spend the night down there with the scouts as part of what was called the Chislehurst Challenge. More of this to follow also. So you can see, it was history. It was destined to be this history. I was going to find out about this place. So what we're going to talk about today, for the next 20 or so minutes, is I'm going to focus on a period in World War II that was known as the Battle of Britain. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. I saw that on a question once on a TV quiz show. They were asked to what it referred, and not one of the contestants knew. I think there was about 6 of them. Not one of them knew. If you are one of those people who doesn't know what battle or what that actually referred to, it was Winston Churchill talking in August about the sacrifices that the Battle of Britain crews had made whilst protecting Britain. Over a period of 3 months in 1940, from July to October, Allied pilots, and it was Allied pilots, pilots from Canada, Poland, Australia, Norway, South Africa, many, many other nations fought to protect the skies above the British Isles from German attacks. The British officially recognise its duration as from the 10th of July until the 31st of October 1940, which overlaps with the period of large-scale night attacks which most people have heard of, called the Blitz. But German historians do not accept this and regard it as a campaign lasting from July 1940 to June 1941. See, historians can never agree on anything at all. Everything's always slightly different. Anyway, the primary objective of the Nazi German forces was to compel Britain to agree to a negotiated peace settlement. In July 1940, the air and sea blockade began, with the Luftwaffe mainly targeting coastal shipping convoys, ports and shipping centres such as Portsmouth. On the 1st of August, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority over the RAF, with the aim of incapacitating RAF Fighter Command. After 12 days of this, it shifted the attacks to RAF airfields and infrastructures, and as the battle progressed, the Luftwaffe also targeted factories involved in aircraft production and strategic infrastructure, and eventually it employed terror bombing on areas of political significance and civilians. The German invasion had swiftly overwhelmed continental countries, as we know from our history, places like France and Poland and such, and Britain now faced the same threat of invasion. But the German High Command knew the difficulties of an unprecedented seaborne attack and its impracticality, whilst the Royal Navy actually commanded the seas. So on July the 16th, Hitler ordered the preparation of Operation Sea Lion as a potential amphibious and airborne assault on Britain to follow once the Luftwaffe had said air superiority over the UK, which they'd been fighting for. In September, German preparation of converted barges was disrupted by the RAF Bomber Command night raids, and the Luftwaffe failed to overwhelm the RAF, forcing Hitler to postpone and eventually cancel Operation Sea Lion. Although there is more recent research come to light that says Hitler actually never intended to invade the UK, but we will never know if he did or not, I do think the actions of the RAF and Allies to stop the Luftwaffe would have certainly changed his mind. Nazi Germany was unable to sustain the daylight raids, but their continued night bombing operations on Britain is what became known as the Blitz. And the fact that they couldn't achieve the air superiority that they were after was probably the first major failure of the Nazi military. The statistics, however, involved in the Battle of Britain do make for quite breathtaking reading. The Allies had around 1,900 aircraft to the Luftwaffe's 2,500. The Allies lost around 1,700 aircraft to the Luftwaffe's nearly 2,000. And the Allies' loss of around 1,500 aircrew to 2,500 of the Luftwaffe shows you the level of battle that was ensuing. These figures don't even include the reported civilian casualties, which numbered in the region of 40,000 people. And keep in mind, this was only over a 3-month period of battle. That's an amazing number of people to be dying through 3 months worth of battle. There were actually different phases of the battle, and my German isn't brilliant, so I will try and pronounce some of these German words as best as I can, but to any German speakers listening, I do apologise. From the 13th of August to the 6th of September, there was something called the Adlerangriff, which means eagle attack, the main assault attempt to destroy the RAF in southern England, and this included massive daylight attacks on RAF airfields, followed by from the 19th of August by heavy night bombings of ports, industrial cities, including the suburbs of London, which is where Chislehurst Caves came in. From the 7th of September to the 2nd of October, the Blitz commences. Day and night attacks on London, constant. And then from the 3rd of October to the 31st of October, large-scale night bombing raids, mostly on London. Daylight attacks now confined to small-scale fighter bomber Storengriff raids, luring RAF fighters into dogfights. On the 13th of August alone, there were more than 20 attacks on British air bases, planned and carried out. And one of those was RAF Biggin Hill, which was home to many of the Spitfires and Hurricanes used to defend the skies throughout that summer period. It must be remembered, however, that the bombings of that era were not as precise as we may see now. Digressing slightly, there was a story I was told recently about a bombing in my hometown of Chelmsford on somewhere called the Hoffman's factory. Now, Hoffman's, to anyone who doesn't know Chelmsford, manufactured ball bearings, all different types of ball bearings, which were actually integral to the war effort. I believe they were one of the largest war manufacturers of ball bearings in the country. So it was a bit of a target for the Germans. And supposedly the German bomber that came in flew in at a height of under 150 feet so that it could guarantee a hit. Now, there were people who were on the 4th floor of the office building that's next to where the Hoffman's factory was, and this building still exists, and ever since hearing this story, every time I drive past it, I just imagine how low that aeroplane was. But anyone who has flown an aeroplane will know that that's pretty darned low, even in a small light aircraft, let alone something like a Dornier or a Junkers or a Heinkel mid-range bomber. The pilot in that case did actually make it out, but to counter these kind of attacks, places that were, if you like, targets for the bombings, had started to put in things like anti-aircraft weaponry. Then they used barrage balloons, and also had nearby fighter bases who would be scrambled to intercept this kind of thing. For these kind of precise hits, the Luftwaffe developed a dive bomber known as the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, probably best known just by the term Stuka bombers. But this proved to be inefficient against the Allies during the Battle of Britain, as it actually did rely on that air superiority which the Luftwaffe had been looking for, and because that wasn't successful, the Stukas just couldn't function in the way they were intended to. So that's kind of the technical stuff. I like talking about aeroplanes. I like that sort of thing, you can probably tell. But what about the social impact of the Battle of Britain and sort of the Blitz afterwards? Now, most people know that Londoners tended, or it might be a bit of a cliche, but they tended to use the tube stations and underground lines for shelter, and that those lucky people who had their own shelters tended to build Anderson shelters in their back gardens. These were sunken tiny bunkers with a kind of a semicircular corrugated iron roof covered in earth to protect it from shock. Latterly, after 1941, Morrison shelters were issued, and these looked like a giant metal table with metal fencing around. They were basically a cage that would sit inside your house and you would crawl into when the air raid siren would go off. Some people had cellars and basements they could use, and some places had communal shelters built. But what did you use if you didn't have any of these? Well, you looked for the next best thing. And in this case, the people of Northern Kent, Greater London, looked at Chislehurst Caves. The amazing thing about this place is it eventually turned into a mini underground town. The caves would open at 7 o'clock every evening, and families would charge 6pence a week for adults and 3pence for children. And those regular visitors were allocated their own pitch. Natural caves in places like Dover and Hastings were also commandeered, but Chislehurst was the largest, perhaps because it was inland and therefore had a larger area to service. Keeping in mind that there were well over 20 air bases in the Kent area alone, and that doesn't include the many across the border into Essex. Bombers returning from a bombing raid on south of Britain had a tendency to drop bombs when they were making a run back to the Channel over wherever they were passing. So if they hadn't had chance to drop it on their target, they would want to get rid of them before they flew back across the Channel. So even if you hadn't actually been struck during an actual raid, there was always a very high chance they could hit you on the way out. So it was danger level was very, very high in the southeast. The caves accommodated around 15,000 people at its height, and by 1941 it had its own cinema, a barber, and 3 canteens where people could queue for tea with their teapots. Very British, isn't it? All very British. Those who fell ill could be treated at the fully functional hospital, which had 7 wards and an isolation unit manned by a Red Cross doctor and 2 nurses. There was a historic birth that took place there, and it was a baby girl, and her name was Rose Kavanagh, to mark her unusual start in life. The story goes that the mum knew she wanted to call her Rose if she was a girl, but didn't know the middle name, and it was the nurse that suggested Kavanagh, or Kavina, however they pronounce it, to mark this little girl's unusual start in life. Others seeking spiritual support could pray at the cave chapel that had been consecrated by the Bishop of Rochester. Even though the caves themselves were at points more than 100 feet underground, you could still hear the noise above, but it was probably a much safer bet than being either in your own home or outside in your little tiny Anderson shelter. Some families would walk for hours to get there each day, and then walk home again the following morning. But imagine every night not knowing if you were going to hear this sound. And if you were not already underground, knowing that you had a short space of time to find shelter, it must have been terrifying. That sound sends shivers down my spine, and I didn't actually have to live through that. Although, having been into the caves myself, I do imagine you could hear the bombs dropping above you, as at points you're only 40 feet or so below ground, and when they told us all to be quiet, you could hear the noise of the cars above the ground. So, who knows what else you could hear when you were sitting in the cave at night. And then not to know when the doors were open the following morning what you were going to step out to find. Remarkably, however, no one is reported to have died down there during World War II. Not adults anyway, which I find absolutely astonishing. Not least because it was reported to have been the largest communal shelter outside of London. It's amazing. Anyway, I think that's probably enough history for now. I think we should take a short break, and then when we return, I think some stories of hauntings and spooky stuff that have been reported in the caves are in order. Don't you?
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
And we're back. So, Chislehurst Caves. What kind of ghost tales have they produced? A lot, perhaps not surprisingly, have been courtesy of the guides who show the tour groups around. But there are a few which I think we should go through. And I won't be mentioning any names because I think the tales themselves talk for themselves. So, the first one I'm going to look at is the Cavalier. To those who don't know, the term Cavalier was applied to supporters of Charles I back in the 1640s, although now we probably associate it more with a certain type of dress. The long flowing hair in ringlets, the brightly coloured ostentatious clothing with elaborate trimmings, lace collars, cuffs, plumed hats. But it's pretty distinctive. And one evening, one of the guides was working in a part of the tunnel that is known as Cavalier's Passage. All of a sudden, he was aware of a noise in the caves and started walking towards the origin of said noise. The tours around the caves had finished at this point, so there should have been no one else down there. As the guide got nearer to where the noise had come from, he could see a stationary figure dressed in clothes from the Cavalier era. This guide was so scared that he actually downed the tools that he had with him and refused to work in the caves for the rest of the night and ran out. Another guide tells of a story when they saw a mist appear in the Cavalier's passageway and then just disappear. On another occasion, this guide was there in the dark and heard footsteps following him. They practice walking around in the dark so that if there's ever a power failure, they can still get their groups out. He heard the footsteps going round and round and round until they just faded away. No one knows why or how a Cavalier would be haunting the caves of Chislehurst, but as it was known to be a mine from the 1200s, it is possible that it was operational in the 1640s. Maybe this person died down there. Maybe they were hiding down there, because we know what happened to Charles I, and that didn't end well for him or quite a few of his supporters, who were the Cavaliers. But we'll never know why there is a Cavalier haunting down there, and there's many other stories and reports of people having seen someone dressed as a Cavalier who just disappears whilst walking along the Cavalier's Passage. There's also quite a sad and possibly scary story of a priest. Now, the story is attributed to the caves. There is a story, attributed to the caves, that a priest went down there alone in the very early 1950s, probably around 1950, 1951, before it was reopened as a tourist attraction. He was meant to have been down there as some kind of penance, and for some reason, part of his penance was to be naked. Anyway, one time, one of the guides was coming round past the modern church towards the end of the tour, and as he moved his torch around, he saw a man crouching down against the wall. His hair was ragged, and his hand was up, shielding himself. When he swung his torch back, this man had gone, was no longer there. But apparently, this experience happened to him more than once, and always in the same place, near the church and by the isolation ward. Could it have been the priest? There is also talk of a man who was lost down there, who the spirit is seen quite frequently of someone in kind of a navy donkey jacket who's quite short, in his late 50s. But again, nobody knows who he is. Nobody can find any stories of why there could be someone down there walking around who got lost down there many, many moons ago. Now, looking at some of the technical paranormal stuff, some of the beliefs, there is a thought that when one of the most common things, I will get my words out, one of the most common things is people think that ghosts can just walk through walls. And people say that they've seen spirits passing through walls and just disappearing. Well, the theory is that they're actually not passing through the structure, but that in the time that they were there, when they existed in a living, breathing sort of body with skin and bone and everything else, that there was no actual wall there, and that maybe their footpath or the doorway or whatever was actually there at that point. And this is illustrated well in this next story. So, as I mentioned, the caves were a bit of a mini town, and they had a cinema during the war period, when it was used as an air raid shelter, as I mentioned. But following the 1950s, a new wall had been put up to stop people being able to use certain footpaths, so that the guides could actually direct people where they wanted them to go, and there was less risk of people getting lost in these, bear in mind, 22 miles worth of tunnels. This guide reports seeing a male figure walk straight in front of him, and then straight through this brick wall towards the cinema. Whether it was the priest or someone else, we don't know, because he was actually dressed. And remember, the priest was reported to have been naked, so it could have been this lost man that we've mentioned, the chap who was in the donkey jacket. But the guy said that the clothes could have been attributed to the 1940s, but could also have been present day. But once the guy sat and thought about it, he realised that at one point this was an entrance to the cinema, and it wasn't bricked up. And he wondered if it was someone maybe who'd lived down there during the war, and they were just going into the cinema to see whatever flick was playing to keep everyone amused that night. What is interesting, what I find interesting, is that they did supposedly find the body of a man in the church, in the chapel down there, when they began excavating in the early 1950s. He was naked, and his fingers were just bloody stumps from where I guess he'd been clawing at the ground. Was this the priest? The reported priest who'd got lost down there whilst doing penance for whatever, we don't know. But we'll never be able to really identify whether it was this priest, because I can't find any proof from the 1950s or any information that there was a missing priest, or of any, I guess, death certificates. The people at Chislehurst probably would know more, but the information isn't out there. But there are reports that they did find a body, and now people report to see a scared naked man carrying against walls from time to time. Is the priest still doing penance 60 years on? Chislehurst has also reported voices in the dark, which most places seem to have. The most common being children and a woman talking to them. Somebody said this sounds like it's a woman asking children to recite things to them, but they can't quite make out what's being said. It's just noise, voices, but quite distinguishable, children's voices, and then an adult's voices. Maybe this was a mum controlling her children from the 1940s, so as perhaps not to disrupt everyone else who was living down there at the time, because it was, if you ever go down there, it was snug. There was a lot of people in what would be a relatively small space now. Maybe it was even earlier than the 1940s. Maybe it was when it was a mine and someone had taken their children down there to see their dad at work, or maybe they'd been working down there as well. Bear in mind, child labour laws, relatively recently that we stopped using children for industrial type stuff, such as that. We don't know. No one has been able to ascertain or hear anything conclusive as to what these voices, or why these voices are there. All we know is that children's voices are heard on a regular basis. Don't know if you remember that I mentioned earlier that no one had actually died down there during World War II. Well, this isn't strictly true. That's why I quantified my thing with no grown-up people had died down there. If women were pregnant, they would normally be taken to the nearest hospital to give birth, as it was safer, as probably people would do now. I mean, I don't really think I fancy giving birth in a cave. Not really my idea of a natural, safe delivery, but sometimes in the middle of an air raid, it would not have been possible to transport a woman in labour to the nearest hospital. It would have been safer for her to be attended to by those Red Cross doctors and nurses in the underground hospital that was there. So they would give birth underground, and out of supposedly the records, there was 5 births during that period when it was used as an air raid shelter, or during the heavy bombardment period. And as I mentioned earlier, one child survived, Rose Kavina, however it's pronounced. But according to the records, 4 other babies didn't, which is sad. No matter what, there's quite a high mortality rate, even back in the 1940s. But maybe those children's voices that are heard are those poor unfortunate souls who didn't make it out of the caves. Maybe it's their mothers are now looking after them and they're talking to them. I don't know. I like to try to be positive, but supposedly the children sound happy and they sound like they're chatting to a female figure. But as most places report hearing voices of some sort or another, sometimes I'm a bit sceptical about voices in places, but it could be true, or it could just be the acoustics of the cave and people are making it up into what they think it actually is. During the war, a group of gypsies were offered shelter in the caves. But after they were accused of being noisy and rowdy, and I do want to quantify, we don't know if they were being noisy or rowdy, but they were accused by some of the other dwellers of being noisy and rowdy. They were moved to a different part of the caves, and this is the oldest part of the caves. And it was also the deepest part of the caves, which did have to be pumped out occasionally because it was prone to flooding. This became known as the Pug End area. Now, nobody knows why the gypsies called it this, but pug doesn't mean necessarily a dog. And what I'm going to say is pug isn't meant to be insulting to anyone who owns a pug dog, but it actually means small demon. But it can also mean small hunchback or imp. Now, I haven't really mentioned this, but the tunnels have been used for druid ceremonies. That's part of where some of the discussion as to how far back they were actually used. One of the beliefs, it was well before they were even used as flint or chalk mines, so pre the Middle Ages, pre the 1200s. However, some of the tests that have been done on one of the altars that's actually carved into the chalk walls of the cave have proved that it's no more than 200 years old, if that. But we don't know. There's been reports of people being seen in white gowns, very sort of druid-esque white gowns. Again, we don't know because there's no records of it. But because this oldest part of the tunnel, had been used for these kind of ceremonies, had they managed to summon something? Is that why the gypsies named it Pug End? This part of the tunnel still makes people feel uncomfortable today, with guests and staff alike being pushed and pulled and generally feeling uneasy. I even found a story about somebody who supposedly felt they had almost like grease on their hands, and when they looked at it, someone turned around and told them it was actually ectoplasm, and that was from the Pug End area. But it obviously has got what it's been called. It would be interesting to know and ask the gypsies who lived down there during World War II why they named it that. Was there a reason? Had they seen something? But we'll never know. Another area, probably for anyone who has been to Chislehurst, this is one of the areas they do, or they did when I went there, they focus on a lot, and they call it the Haunted Pool. It's kind of like a glorified, it isn't even a pool, it's kind of like a paddling pool, I guess. But the tour guides do like to highlight this area. They make it seem very auspicious and very scary. I, for one, didn't feel at all intimidated in there by this pool that's meant to be haunted. And I'm not the only one. I've read others' tales of people who said, no, in the tunnels that wasn't the bit that unnerved me the most. And if I'm honest, the bit that unnerved me the most was the chapel. Now, I'm spotting a parallel here because I know when I talked about Kilmainham Jail I mentioned that the chapel unnerved me, so I don't know if that I should be just staying away from anywhere with religious connotations. But anyhow, read up on some of the other experiences that people have had, and I'm not the only one who's ever felt like that about the chapel, and I went in there not knowing of different places that people had supposedly had negative experiences. Anyway, this pool, it's there, you can see it, and it's apparently, or it's meant to have been, the site of a murder in the 1800s. The drowning of a woman named Beckett by her husband. Supposedly, or as the myth goes, he was actually hung for his crime. But, as you may imagine, records are few and far between. So it's very, very hard to confirm one way or the other if there was a murder of a woman called Mrs. Beckett and that her husband was found guilty of it and hung as a result. But the tunnels would have been accessible at this time. During World War II, however, the pool was actually deemed to be quite a high risk for people tripping, falling in, etc., etc., because they only had the basics of candlelight and that kind of thing to see. So they did actually fill it in during that point when it was used as an air raid shelter. Where the sort of haunting stories come in is there's an awful lot of reports of people who don't actually know the history of the pool when they first see it. And they said they've seen a mist-like, quite pale-coloured figure standing by the pool, and then it moves towards them, and they feel like it's following them. And then when they turn round, when they get the guts to turn round, because until that point they're scared because they think this ethereal figure is following them away from this haunted pool, it's right back where they first saw it, and then just disappears. The accounts I read, interestingly enough, it seems to be women that this has appeared to more than the male guides or the male visitors to the to the caves. Don't know if this is valid or if it's just something that the men hadn't noticed, but the story goes that it is the shadow or the figure of Mrs. Beckett trying to get out of the caves to escape her husband, her abusive husband. But then again, could it be something from even longer ago? Because the records of deaths in the caves are pretty much non-existent. Yet, when it was used as a mine, sort of looking at history, it would have surprised me if there weren't the odd cave-in, if you pardon the expression, or the odd person who just collapsed from exhaustion. So it wouldn't surprise me if there had been other deaths down there. But the haunted pool, ask them about the haunted pool if you ever go down to the caves and visit, which you should. Oh, we're into our last 15 minutes of the show on Chislehurst Caves. Well done, if you're still sticking with me. I hope you've been able to hear everything nicely and clearly. No, well, if there's stuttering, it's probably been me messing up my words, so hopefully the sound has been a lot better for you this time. Unfortunately, there's so much that we don't know about the caves that it's almost impossible to correlate some of the haunting events and supernatural tales that have been told. We can't actually correlate them with actual events because the records just don't exist. But there's quite a lot of parts of it that I haven't even mentioned, such as the Roman well. Now, I didn't mention that the caves have been used. We used them as a weapon storage. They were used to farm mushrooms. They were used as an air raid shelter. They were used as a music venue by the sort of top rock bands of their time. And I haven't been into the room where they used to do the gigs. The acoustics in there would have been amazing. I would have loved to have seen someone like Jimi Hendrix in the 60s in his day. But I'm digressing, I apologise. But the other thing it's been used for is filming. Doctor Who, for example, filmed down there in, I think it was the late 60s, early 70s. And apparently they were filming down there near what's called the Roman Well in the 1960s. And an apparition was seen by one of the lead actresses in the programme that was being filmed. And it terrified her so much that she ran out and had to be very, very strongly coaxed back down to the caves to finish her scenes. I haven't mentioned the strange lights that are seen dancing along the walls where no lights are on or being shone in the direction of. Maybe this is one of the gigs from the 1960s still carrying on, or could it be one of the favourites on things like Ghost Adventures and its orbs playing on the walls? Who knows? Who knows about that one? But I haven't talked about any of the tales yet about that. I haven't mentioned the animal hauntings that are reported to be down there. There's reportedly a black dog that haunts it. But like with the voices, who doesn't have a story of a black dog? Everywhere has a story of a black dog. It's seen roaming the tunnels on occasions. Dog prints have been found in the dust on the cave tunnel floors. There's people have heard noises of animals screaming. Now, if you never heard an animal scream, you probably wouldn't know, but it is quite a distinctive noise. Now, this one, the animal screaming, there may be some historical bias to it, because supposedly, in the records that I've found, there was a very large stable of horses with a few other agricultural type animals that was actually above the caves, which was bombed and destroyed during World War II, and it killed all of the animals. Maybe that's where the screaming comes from. The whole animals have their spirits are trying to find safety in the cave tunnels. But we haven't really talked about that. We haven't talked about the myth that supposedly the late Michael Jackson was thinking of buying a property in Chislehurst that was actually going to be above the caves. But when he found out about how haunted and the activities that were meant to go on in the caves, I suppose, after dark, although it is always dark down there if you don't have a torch, but after dark, it scared him and he decided to pull out of the property purchase. We don't know. But there's an awful lot of activity reported around a place that, to be honest, most people haven't even heard of, which I think should change because it's a fascinating place. So, I don't know if you remember that when I was telling my story of how I found out about it, and I went to tell my dad thinking I was all clever that I'd found this historical landmark that he hadn't heard of. I should have known better. He mentioned the Chislehurst Challenge, that back when he was a teenager with the Scouts, they were dared to go down there, and I think he said it was Halloween, although I'm not sure if that's his memory going a bit, but he admits he didn't last long. But he still stresses to me that he doesn't believe in ghosts, and that not many challengers could ever stay the whole night, but he certainly doesn't believe in ghosts or things that go bang, bump in the night. Although I did hear a very funny story when I was talking to someone else about this Chislehurst Challenge who'd actually heard of it, and he said there was one guy who managed to stay down there the whole night. All his friends had disappeared, they couldn't do it, and one of the requirements, if you like, of doing the Chislehurst Challenge, and for those of you who think, why would anyone want to scare the hell out of themselves, who doesn't believe in ghosts, who's not interested in discovering anything paranormal, and wants to stay on their own in 22 miles of tunnels that's around 100 feet underground? Well, back in the 50s when it started, it was the £5 Chislehurst Challenge. So they would actually give you £5 if you managed to stay the night, which back in the 1950s, £5 that wasn't a bad little payoff for one night in the caves. Anyway, this chap, he was down there with the allowable candles. You're only allowed candlelight if you were doing the challenge. And he tripped and knocked himself out in fright when his candle blew out suddenly and he was left in the pitch black. And supposedly he was only woken up the following morning when the staff unlocked to come and find him. And he was one of the few people who was able to last all night. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but I think it's quite an amusing one, and probably the only way some people would manage to spend the night down there with just candlelight and nothing else. So, saying candlelight only. Now, anyone who's been in somewhere pitch black, and this place is completely pitch black. There's no light sources coming in whatsoever. When you do the tour, they do make it go pitch black, and then they hit a big drum to show you how the noise would have reverberated around the tunnels. In fact, we were down there and my little boy was about 4 years old, I think 3 or 4 years old, and we did actually have to cover his ears because it frightened him a little bit. So with candles sort of flickering and strange shadows being cast, I can imagine that people would, they wouldn't, because if your candle went out or your candle was flickering and you were in a dark part of it, you probably wouldn't even be able to see your hand in front of your own face. And I can understand why it would be easy then for the brain to conjure up things and look on the bad side of life. if you know what I mean, and think there's things there that maybe there isn't. The challenges stopped in the 1980s as the owners decided that the liability risks were just not worth it. And the last challenge was actually by two of the guides who work there. And they were experienced guides. They worked there on a daily basis. They knew what the tunnels were about. And they decided that they would take it in turns. They would sleep in shifts, so one could keep an eye on the other one and make sure the candles didn't go out or whatever. And not long into the first sleep shift, the guide who had stayed awake started to hear strange noises, like a scuffling noise. And then he heard a piercing scream coming from where his friend was sleeping in his sleeping bag. He went to find him and found his colleague, who was asleep, flailing around like he was trying to fight someone off. Although the guide who was watching it, observed it, said it could have been mistaken for an epileptic fit. But this man had never had a fit before, so if it was that, it was medically quite strange that it suddenly happened. But when the flailing and the thrashing subsided, he said he looked at his colleague's face and he opened his eyes, and the face was, whilst the body was that of his friend, the face was that of an old man's, with cracks and dry taut skin. And he started prowling around like an animal, coming towards him on all fours and uttering guttural, feral type noises. And he said his eyes were red, they were glowing red. And he then tried to attack his friend who had come to find him. His friend, terrified, tried to subdue him, but he said this guide colleague of his, who was not responding to his name at all, kept coming at him and growling and had this strange red eyes and aggressive look in his face. The guide who was awake pressed the emergency buzzer that they had to get up to the above ground and asked them to come and open the caves. But his friend didn't want to leave, even though he was starting to act a bit more normally again. Even after he really started to calm down, and he was looking like himself and he was talking normally and such, he still didn't want to leave. He didn't want to be taken to hospital to be checked out to see if he had perhaps had an epileptic fit. And he was still acting a little bit strange and a little bit aggressive towards them. So much so that nobody wanted to leave him. Nobody wanted to walk off on their own because they were scared, or they didn't want to leave him on his own with just one or maybe two people because he was a big guy and they were scared what he might do. It was only after he was taken out of the cave completely and removed from the grounds that he just became himself again. The person in question, interestingly enough, remembers nothing about the event and puts it down to a one-off epileptic episode, of which he's suffered none prior, or none since. The gentleman in question doesn't believe in the paranormal. He doesn't believe in ghosts. But what he did say is that although he doesn't believe in them, he doesn't disbelieve it if somebody else tells him they've had an experience. Was it his mind playing tricks on him? Had he built his stress levels up into something that caused his mind to almost attack him? Don't know. Or did he truly experience something paranormal that took over his body and his mind? We'll never know for sure. But with the amount of history that has occurred in that place, both documented and the unknown stuff, which we can only offer as pure conjecture as to what could have happened, the energy that must be held within those tunnels, it would not surprise me if there was something nasty and malignant loitering. Remember, the Druids were meant to have conducted sessions down there. Who knows if they ever sacrificed? Who knows if they ever conjured anything up? Or who knows what was on the grounds beforehand? We don't know. But not surprisingly, the owner, who was actually privy to all of this, she was one of the first down there to open up the caves to get them out, decided to stop the challenges once and for all. It wasn't worth it as far as she was concerned. And they even had the caves exercised afterwards, because the paranormal experiences that people were reporting, even though they didn't know about the experiences these two guides had, were reaching crescendo levels. Wouldn't it be lovely to go down there, though, and do one of those challenges? Maybe one day they'll let people to go down again, and if they do, my name is top of the list, even for just a £5. So, that has been my whistle-stop tour of Chislehurst Caves, a truly fascinating place just outside London, near Bromley in Kent, if you ever fancy a trip there. Next week's show will feature a guest. We're going to have John Hippersley of Canterbury Ghost Tours on the show, and he and I will be talking about the Canterbury witch trials and what happened to the poor, unfortunate 1,800 or so victims of that. It should be quite gory and quite interesting, as John is a brilliant presenter. Thank you again for joining me. This has been Penny G. Morgan of Parasearch UK Radio, talking to you about some of my favourite haunted histories. Don't forget to join us 6 days a week for all paranormal and beyond. That just leaves me to say goodbye, sleep tight, don't worry about things that go bump in the night.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.